Hey friends, welcome back to Space for Life. This is the relaunch episode of the podcast that last appeared a little bit over a year ago. During that year, I took a year of Jubilee, a sabbatical year, not even knowing whether I would return to the podcasting world, but I'm so excited to be relaunching Space for Life. And this episode will talk about specifically the lessons that I've learned over the last year when I took some time off and actually created space in my life and how that informs where we're going forward. So it was an amazing year with some incredible experiences. And I look forward to sharing in this episode lessons that I've learned and excitement about the path that we're going to be going forward in Space for Life. Man, it's good to be back together.
It is good to be back. I'm glad to see you. It's been almost a year.
I know. And before, earlier this afternoon, I listened to the farewell episode, which was kind of surreal because I actually don't normally listen back on episodes. And there was such a finality to it.
Yeah.
And now we're back together. So it makes me very happy.
Well, I remember that episode and I was really sad. I felt like you dropped a bomb when you said you were leaving. So I'm glad that you're back after a year. And when we left, you said the reason you were leaving is you were taking a year of Jubilee, which is a word that you used. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I want to hear, first of all, the whole idea of a year of Jubilee is sort of like an ancient sounding word.
Right.
So before we hear about it, what is a year of Jubilee?
Yeah, it's a great concept, and I don't think there's necessarily anything magical about it being a year of. Mm-hmm. It came out of the Bible, out of this concept with the Israelites of them having periods of 7 years, and every seventh year they would have a Sabbath year. And during that Sabbath year, they would stop working the land. Mm-hmm. They were supposed to, at least. And then after 7 cycles of 7 Sabbath years, they were then supposed to experience a year of Jubilee, which was like a double Sabbath almost to it, which involved forgiving debts. It involved a whole lot, but it was this year that was both this combination of Sabbath and of celebration. Mm-hmm. And I think in reality, when I now look back on 2021, which was the year in which I kind of came to the conclusion that I needed a Jubilee, I think a little bit of what was going on inside of me is I was working really hard and in high drive mode, doing all the various things that I was doing, from the podcast to blog to coaching to the book to other business ventures. And I was in high drive, and I realized that things had gotten out of whack, out of balance, but yet I had so much identity tied into who I was and what I was doing that I couldn't even give myself permission to slow down. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of Jubilee from the Bible, which I think was really kind of God's grace in planting that in me, was almost my excuse for being able to say, okay, it's time to celebrate all of the things that God has done. For a while, to celebrate. I don't need to worry about what's on the other side of it, but I'm called to stop for a while, to stop and Sabbath and to celebrate. And so that idea of taking an intentional pause, and a pause to say thank you and to celebrate, I think it's a powerful one that is massively absent in our society and culture.
Yeah, I mean, when you describe why you took the year of Jubilee, it almost sounds like the word that we use now called burnout. Like you were coming close to burnout, but it's a nice way of thinking about it. Maybe it's a step before burnout where you have to give up and you have to walk away from everything. that it's a positive acknowledgement of something I think that happens to all of us if we're being,
Yeah.
productive, if we're kind of hard driving people. Inevitably, we're going to get ourselves in situations where we've made commitments, where we've set goals that are a little bit too much for us, and we have to
Right.
pull back. And what I like about the year of Jubilee, the way you're saying it, is rather than framing it in a negative, I've failed light, it's more like, let's take time to celebrate what has happened.
Yes. But I think on the other side of that, I think the reality is I probably was moving to burnout.
Okay.
And I wasn't there, but I was moving in that direction. I could feel myself, but I probably couldn't handle admitting to myself the weakness that I would associate with burnout. So I needed some way to frame it a little bit differently. Good and positive, but I think it's a little bit of God's grace that left to my own, I was probably headed that direction towards burnout because I wasn't putting in the natural limitations that I needed to. It was just, it was my classic. If it's good, then do more of it.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, burnout is such a common problem now because there is no structural aspect of our society that has a built-in rest.
Right.
And I mean, we all know the reasons why. We no longer have a 40-hour work week because our work bleeds into our evening. We can work from home. Our work bleeds into our weekend.
Right.
We can work around the clock. We have so many opportunities to keep going that burnout is almost inevitable for all of us. So I like that you took the time to have a year of Jubilee. And for those people listening who think, I can't take a year of Jubilee, we're going to talk about that,
Right.
about ways to celebrate without taking a whole year off. But before we get into that, I do want to hear, you had some goals going into the year of Jubilee. But now looking back on it, what would you say you've learned in retrospect?
Wow, there were a lot of lessons. It was as I began to think about that, there was a flood of things, and there wasn't like kind of a specific thing, but there were a couple of things that really stood out. I had in my mind with Jubilee that I was going to press this button of day one of Jubilee, and that life was going to go from busy and stressful and in some ways hard, and that I would be able to pull the switch, and all of a sudden God was going to give me a year of happiness and joy and celebration. And there were some circumstances even in the first couple of months of Jubilee that were really hard. And I kept on thinking, so when's Jubilee going to start? And then fast forward about a month or two later, I started down this totally unexpected track of learning about health in a way that was so much fun for me and so exciting and so life-changing for me, but it was not planned in the slightest when I thought about Jubilee. And so almost my theme verse that I look back on the year, it's in Proverbs, I believe, it says, man makes his plans, but it's the Lord's purposes that prevail. And it's like I had all of these images of all the celebration and travel and vacations and joy and experiences I would have, and the freedom. And yet God kind of said, that's very nice, Tommy. Go right on into that. And then his purposes prevailed, which had a lot of joy and celebration and some amazing experiences. But there were learnings that I never could have imagined in it. And so I think that is the truth of life is that we are meant to plan and we are meant to co-participate in life. But life is full of surprises and unanticipated things. And from a faith perspective, God's purposes will prevail. And that's a great comfort for me. So I learned that it's kind of great to go with the flow of where God was taking the year. And it was a fantastic year in so many ways, but was probably more unexpected in terms of where it went than expected in terms of where it went.
So your health sort of phase, or I wouldn't even call it a phase, because this health phase, which maybe we can talk about another time, has really stuck and been hugely life-changing.
Yeah.
But I'll just observe this about you. We podcasted a lot about health before. And that was a time in your life where you had plans and you were setting goals and you were
Right.
you had a lot of different streams of content that you were putting out there, and you were really producing a lot, and you accomplished a lot of those goals, and then you stop all of it, and you had this health interest that started. Would that have happened if you hadn't cleared the slate?
No.
So you don't think, because this health transformation that you've had has been huge,
Oh, it's been huge.
and you don't think that would have happened?
I mean, I feel like I can say categorically it wouldn't have.
Interesting.
Because it came out of the space that was inevitable by having a year of Jubilee.
Okay.
And by having that space, I am by nature a voracious learner. And all of a sudden I was pulled into, in an unexpected way, some things to learn about that I had never learned or understood. If I didn't have that space, if my days were filled with all of the things, all of the good things that I was doing, I never would have had the bandwidth to dive into this. I don't think I would have had the internal openness to learn in the way that I did. And that's part of the power of, I think, creating space, which is part of the power of Jubilee, is that we think that if we create space and that if we slow down, that our progress will slow down, that we will be less impactful, and that we will learn less. And yet I learned so much this year. I feel like in this past year, I grew more than I can remember in previous years. And that's what was so exciting about it. So that is, the whole reason I wrote Space to Breathe Again is because I've got a problem. I've got a problem with filling my life with more and more and continuing to do it. And that's what happened in 2020 and 21. And that is my natural inclination. And this year was a reminder of that core lesson God taught Wheezy and I 30 years ago, of the value and the critical nature of having space and margin in our life. And it's like I had forgotten my own core lesson. And so Jubilee brought me back to that in a way that I really hope will stick now for a long time going forward.
Well, it's interesting because I think as you were approaching burnout, we think of burnout in such a negative light, but intuitively your body maybe knew that your life was too saturated and it was talking to you, and you were able to take this year off. And I love that you say that, you grew more in a year where you had cleared the slate.
Right.
because growth was just in you. It was natural, and you cleared the slate, and you were open to surprises and what would come your way, and you had the freedom to do that. Was it a fun year,
Yes.
being able to
Well,
have more space?
to a large extent, it
Yeah.
was a fun year. I think one of the lessons of a year of Jubilee like this is that life doesn't stop. You
Yeah.
know, I thought somehow life was going to go on pause and that the hard things would stop, and they didn't, and they don't. So there were plenty of hard things going on within the year, but there was a lot of joy. There was a lot of freedom in taking this break, and I realized that I am internally very resistant to giving myself freedom. That I am driven seeing my value in what I produce and my impact, and to be freed up by that. And I think one of the real blessings of the year of Jubilee is I felt like I was given that freedom by God. And as I think a lot of us are wired to think of God as someone who is more prone to drive us and to expect a lot of us and demand a lot of us, not to revel in our joy and in our space. And so part of the lesson of this past year was beginning to lean into that God could be pleased, that God could enjoy when I was completely relaxing and doing something that might even feel extravagant. And even that is an expanding of my view of how big God is in this. So that was great. The another lesson that kind of came on the side of this, again, such a good, healthy lesson, was the awareness of how small I am. And by that, I mean, I think that in the midst of 2020 and 21, so 2020, at the end of the year was when I finished and we published and launched the book Space to Breathe Again. And then we were doing the podcast and blogging, and I was doing coaching and consulting. There was a lot of things that were basically lifting me up and saying, you're something. You're really doing something. And as I stopped all of that, it was incredibly freeing to realize that those somethings that I was doing were all so tiny in the grand scheme of things. Whether you have a podcast that reaches X number of people or a book that sells whatever, it's all so very, very tiny. And so I realized in this year of Jubilee, there was the freedom of being small, of saying, I can just be myself. And I am always going to be small. We all are, I mean, even some of the people that we think are really big are really small in the scheme of history and everything else going on. And that was a very good, healthy reset for me that I'm thankful for. I needed the reminding.
I think that is one of the costs of success, is that this sense of self-importance kind of sneaks up on you. And I remember my sister saying this to me. I had been leading this organization. This was in my younger, early parenting years. And she called me out on something at one point. She said, Patricia, when we were in high school, you were so good at being a good friend and at listening. And she was like, I don't think I was great at it. She goes, I feel like we may have flipped a little bit. I have gotten really good at listening, and I think it's a little bit of a struggle for you. And it was so good she said that to me, because I wasn't dealing with not listening to people in my own sphere. But I was struggling with listening to her because I felt like what I was doing was so important. And I didn't, I mean, honestly, I could say I just didn't feel like what she was doing at that moment with her day. I wasn't super interested in it. We were in the grind of being
Yeah.
young moms, and I'm embarrassed to say it now.
Yeah.
But what happens when we get good at what we're doing is we have this sense of self-importance that sneaks up on us. And the cost of that self-importance is that we become larger than we actually are. And then that brings with it a weight that we're not built to carry. And I think that in itself can lead to burnout because we think we're more important than we are. And it cuts us off from really noticing other people as much, noticing the world around us, being blessed and in awe and wonder of things around us because we're so focused on our own importance and success. And you find this in communities where there's a lot of high achievement, where there's a lot of like money or athletic success, that it gets their scope gets small and almost like a bubble. And there's something toxic that happens when we become so self-important. So I love that you're saying in your year of Jubilee, when you stopped all the quote unquote productive, successful things you were doing, that there was a freedom that came from it because your eyes were open to how small you are.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is something that I really long for. And I think as human beings, that's one of the reasons we're intuitively drawn to landscapes of majesty, like the ocean and the mountains make us feel small. So why would we enjoy that?
Yeah.
Like, why would we enjoy feeling small in the scheme of the world and the earth? But there's something really appropriate and freeing about it.
It is. It is very freeing to realize that, you're small. And I think I almost laugh now to think of, in essence, the big head that would get around the little stuff that I'm doing. But, I guess we're all wired to that. And I think that it just reinforced to me in such a clear way the necessity of regularly stepping back because we just lose sight of these things that just start to well up within us. We don't even know what's going on. And, so I needed that year of Jubilee, and God knew I needed it, and God blessed me with it. Mm-hmm. And I think God loved seeing me happier in a sense with that. And I loved what I was doing. It wasn't that I didn't love what I was doing, but I was driven by what I was doing. And we're not often happy when we're driving. We're tense, we're pushing, and that's not all bad unless it's all that's going on.
Right. So what if you can't take a year of Jubilee? Like, what if that's not an option, but you feel like you're approaching burnout, or you feel this need to just stop it all?
Right.
Maybe you're getting sick a lot. Like, I know I get sick.
Right.
My body makes me sick when I need to take a break.
Right.
It's like it knows things that I don't know. And sometimes it's even a relief. But wouldn't it be nice to be able to pull back without being sick? So what about for those of us who can't take a year off?
Well,
what have you learned?
So
what could we do?
in 2021, I spent probably 3 to 6 months trying to figure out a lot of this. So I went through all of these gyrations in the middle part of 2021 of saying, okay, well, maybe I just need to stop the blogging. That'll create enough space and I can kind of get back control of things. Then I thought, no, that's not the thing. Maybe I should just stop the podcast. I'll just stop that. That'll create some space. Then no, that's not it. And then thought cutting back on the coaching. So I kept on working to try to find halfway measures that could give me just enough that I could just keep on pushing the way that I was pushing. And so I think what I found was necessary, what I think God showed me was necessary is that, no, I needed to pull all the way back. So what I would suggest for others is that there are all sorts of possibilities for mini jubilees that we can take. But if we want to take a mini jubilee, it needs to be something where we're all in, even in that mini. And so often, how many of us take vacations where we're consistently answering emails, where we're consistently stay connected to the very things that are exhausting us back home or whatever. And what my encouragement would be is whether your mini jubilee is a night away with your spouse, that is a complete disconnect, or a weekend, or a long weekend, or a 1 week, that the power of the concept of Jubilee, I think, is to allow yourself a full disconnect during that time. I think it's certainly more important and more needed that the longer we can do it, the better.
Sure.
But, life goes on and we don't have those freedoms at all time. But we all have more freedom than we realize, I think. And so in the midst of that, I would say, if you are sensing in your body, in your spirit, that the idol has gotten too high, that your body is starting to respond, that you're not finding joy anymore, then stop, build that firewall out in the future and say, okay, a month from now, we're just going to take a long weekend and we're going to get away, whether it's with the kids or without the kids, but we're going to get away and we're going to totally disconnect and we're just going to have fun together. And we're going to create space, we're going to Sabbath, and we're going to celebrate. So it's the halfway that we tend to think will get us there that gets us very little.
Yeah, I see that halfway thing. And there's not enough, like when we only go halfway, there's not enough of a reward for it to feel worth it.
Yes.
I read a book recently and heard a podcast called 24/6, and it's by a woman who's secular and Jewish, and she has been and heavily steeped in Silicon Valley internet work. Like she spends all her time online. And she has invited her family to do what's called a tech Shabbat, which is a Sabbath from screens. And she does it on Saturday. But the reason I bring that up, because this isn't a tech, break podcast, but what she started it as, and the way she framed it is, imagine your ideal Saturday. What would you do? And they started as a family talking about all the things they love to do together. And they liked to enjoy a cup of coffee leisurely, reading the paper. I posed this question to a group of friends recently, and the things they said were great. Like one of them loved to watch Premier League soccer in the morning on Saturday. Now that's a screen, but maybe that was restful for them. The other one would take a long bike ride on the Capitol Trail, which is, the trail downtown. Right. And it's such a fun idea. Instead of thinking I'm burnt out, I need to take a break, I need to cut all these things out of my life, to think, what's a day of the week that I can devote to celebration and doing things that I love to do? I know this woman baked challah bread and had people over for dinner, wow, and the family would go for walks. So I appreciate that, because I think so many of us can't take a full year off, but even just a day where you do the questioning of like, what's a whole day where I could just enjoy myself. And I have tried this in a halfway way.
Right.
But I do find the phone undermines it significantly
It does, yeah.
that's where all my work comes from
Right.
is email and phone. So I was able to. I read the book 2 months ago, and I've only been able to pull it off once, where I was away from my phone for a whole day, and it was amazing. I'm gonna take what you're saying and think about it. How can I take a day and fully commit to a day of celebration and fun?
Right. And I think that in doing such, we should recognize that we're exercising very unexercised muscles, and that at first we're likely to be sore. In other
Yeah.
words, it's not going to come easily. That first day that you try to go without your phone, you will probably be never be more aware that you're without your phone than ever. So it may take a little while of practice to get to the freedom part, just
Yeah.
like with any discipline or anything that we experience. So the joy may not be there immediately. It might be first the discomfort of it.
Well, and I do think it's easier to do when you're out of town.
Yes.
Because you just say, I'm out of town. So nobody's going to be calling you and saying, hey, can you do this? You don't have to respond to things. So, even just driving to the mountains for the day or,
Yes.
some kind of vacation. So I appreciate that. So in looking back in retrospect, if you could sum up your lessons, you have said one of the things you learned is that you can make plans, but the Lord knows what's going to happen, and He surprised you. So that was one of the things. The other thing you said is that you had the joy and the freedom that comes from realizing how small you are.
Right.
And any other thoughts
Yeah.
about what you learned in retrospect?
There is so much life to be found in right-sizing life. And right-sizing life means that there needs to be a rhythm between doing and being, and doing and enjoying, producing and having experiences, having time for people, and churning out tasks. And in the year before Jubilee, that all got out of balance, out of whack. I was in massively high productivity mode. And life is to be found in the right rhythm. And there has to be the right rhythm between doing and being, between relationships and productivity. And I desperately needed to recover that right rhythm. I had gotten way out of rhythm. And so to me, maybe one of the more profound lessons was I got saved to get my life back in track. And now I feel like, okay, now I hope to keep it in that right size.
Sure. Well, have you ever seen a balance board?
Yeah.
So I can't do it. But my 75-year-old father, who's super fit and athletic, he can do it. And I've watched him do it in my living room. And he's also kind of a metaphorical thinker. And he said, a balance board is you're standing on it and you kind of, it goes to one side a little too far. And then you have to push it back to the other side. And he said, if a balance board, you never can just stand on it. You're always moving. You're always adjusting and tweaking. And so you had 2 years ago, or for a couple of years of high productivity, and then you took a year of high rest.
Yes.
And now you're back to some productivity, and you're hoping to have better rhythms of rest and not too much doing, and honoring being and honoring relationships.
Right.
And now we're doing a podcast again. So now you're back to doing what are your hopes for this podcast?
Well, and we talked about this just a little bit before we kind of got in front of a microphone on it. And one of my real hopes for this is to just have a fun time with it. To not take it too seriously, because I love growing. I love learning. I love teaching. That's all it needs to be. You know, God will do nothing or whatever he will do with it. If any of these things that we talk about are helpful to people, then that's just great. You know, that's just pure joy to me. But to blow this out of proportion and to get too serious and to grind at it, I want for this podcast, for us to have a great time, for me to have a great time having conversations with other people who are living fantastic, meaningful, purposeful lives. I want this podcast to be a joy. And in the freedom of that, hopefully there will be meaningful things for other people. So, one of my quote goals for this is to keep this in its place, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it is fun, but I also personally have missed the free personal coaching that I get from doing these podcasts with you. So I've really missed it. But seriously, I think that is something that you're naturally good at that not everyone is that you have these systems of order or systems of living that come easily to you and they don't to other people. And I really benefited from that. And I think other people do too. And I think what happens is you've got your listeners who, everyone who listens to this podcast is interested in growing. And so they're showing up because they want to grow. And that's just automatically a really fun, positive space.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward. I know you have a lot of ideas for things you want to cover. What are some of the things, if you're listening and you know you're joining in, what are we going to talk about?
Well, one of the reasons that I had to get back into this is in my little planner, I was developing a list of topics. Not even knowing what I would do with them, but it just kept on growing and growing. I went, it's just like it's going to burst in me. I have to have someone to talk to about this stuff. And so I realized that the podcast in particular is one of the most enjoyable things that I was doing. Mm-hmm. And so, what to expect, one of the places that that's going to be fun for me to grow in with the podcast this time is that we're going to introduce, as a lot of you are seeing, a video element to this. That it was pure audio before, and I thought, wow, why not also make this into a YouTube channel?
TikTok? Are you going on TikTok, Tommy?
Ooh, that's really pushing it. I'm not sure I'm quite going to be TikTok, but who knows?
Who knows?
That's right. So video is going to be fun. We'll have a fun time playing with that and seeing, what we can do and how that can be helpful for everything. I also think this year expanded a whole lot of things that I've learned about that I see a tremendous amount of value, health-related things, other ways of growing that I really hadn't given a lot of thought to. So I think this year is going to be a broader stroke at how do we grow and live and have whole lives than perhaps we did in the first year. And I'm really excited about that because I've had a blast learning and trying to apply and seeing change in myself as I've started to put some of these things into practice.
Well, I'm glad. And I think change we think about is not always fun, but I'm sitting across from you and I've, been hanging out with you all year and you have made change look pretty fun. So I'm excited.
Yeah.
I'm excited to learn and, I'm glad to be back.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for whoever's joining in and listening to this. It's just exciting to be back doing this again. And I think we've got already kind of a lineup of some really interesting topics and some people. So we're really excited to be back online. Share your feedback, whatever. I really appreciate the people who are listening and joining in on all this.
Sounds good. Great. See you next time.
Great. Bye.